As we are PC users, we all know how important is having a PC with better PC components for far better values. It's everyone's dreams to have a better processor with compatible motherboards that many can buy. This is the year 2020, and I believe that most of us currently using AMD Ryzen PCs, even though Intel introduced their new line of 10th gen CPUs. Based on most benchmarks out there, AMD processors are yet perform well and affordable processors that money can buy currently in 2020. There are people who are use AMD Ryzen processors in their gaming systems as well as workstations, especially from Ryzen Gen 1 series up to Gen 3 3000 series processors. In this video, I'm going to show you one of the iconic Ryzen Gen 1 compatible motherboard. So I decided to do this video of unboxing this motherboard. This motherboard, when first released, it was only compatible with Ryzen Gen 1 series CPUs and AMD A series APUs. But big thanks to AMD as they decided to keep the same socket compatibility with their Ryzen 2nd and 3rd gen processors. Therefore, we all had the chance to use our good old motherboards with any of AMD Ryzen processors. This is one of the ASRock very first AM4 socket gaming motherboard which designed specifically for gamers and for PC enthusiasts who are more likely to overclock their Ryzen CPUs. As many of us already know, that Gen 1 motherboards out of the box can only be used with Gen 1 processors. However, by simply upgrading motherboard BIOS, you can still use the same motherboard with Ryzen Gen 2 and Gen 2 series processors, which allow users to upgrade their processors from Gen 1 to Gen 2 or Gen 3. That is one of the gifted idea that AMD created for their customers. Based on my experience, some of us still not aware of this information, and we are blindly purchase motherboards with newer chipset, or some of us already aware that they still have a chance to use their old motherboard with newer processors, but they don't know how to upgrade the BIOS correctly. So if you are still planning to buy or upgrade your PC to Ryzen 2nd gen processor or 3rd gen processor, this video will help you to understand why you should not buy a new motherboard if you are having an old somewhat decent motherboard like this. In this video, I'm going to show you how this motherboard behave out of the box, and also I'm going to show you how to upgrade the BIOS to make this motherboard compatible with Ryzen Gen 2 and Gen 3 series processors to get the most performance out of it. So, without making further delay, let's get into action. First of all, we open this box, and then we can see how is the motherboard looks like when it's out of the box. With a couple of SATA cables, IO shield, few M.2 screwdriver screws, SCSLI bridge. Most of us no longer use this anymore. And installation guide. CD, most of us no longer use CDs anymore. Use a manual and ASRock casing sticker. And below that, we have the motherboard. This is actually pretty nice looking motherboard, even though it's old, 3-4 years old. This is one of the very first ASRock X370 chipset motherboard, and it's one of the very good motherboard. Now what we're gonna do is I'm going to set this motherboard up into my bench, and I'm going to show you how to the motherboard booting up with Ryzen 1st gen, and then I'm going to show you what will happen when you install Ryzen second gen processor or third gen processor into this motherboard, and then I will show you what will happen after upgrade the BIOS of this motherboard. Right, now I have set up the motherboard on my bench. It's connected to the power supply, 4 GB, 8 GB RAM. Yes, 8 GB, 2400 megahertz DDR4 RAM module. Also, I connected this board to the small monitor here, and keyboard all set. And I have the processor. It's actually to Ryzen 2nd Gen 2200G APU. So this has built-in graphics, so we don't need external graphic card here. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna install this processor into the motherboard and power it up and see how it works. So remember, I haven't done anything to the motherboard. I haven't done anything to the BIOS. So this motherboard is as it is from out of the box. And so let's get into it and see how it goes. Let's take this up. I have the third gen CPU as well. First, I'm gonna go with the second gen CPU. Remember, always there's only one way the CPU seated on this socket. Need to follow this arrow key here, align with the motherboard arrow key there. So close this. I got a cooler. And connect this cooler to the CPU header here. Right, all set up. I haven't connected any hard drives. I haven't connected any graphic cards. Only keyboard. And it's got a trackpad, so I can use that as a mouse. Let's power it up and see. Now the board is powered up. You can see CPU fan is start spinning, but the debug LEDs stays on 0, and also we don't get any display output at all. Now the motherboard keep restarting and looking for the CPU, because this happened. I believe this happened to most of us when you get the X370 motherboard. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to download the latest BIOS for this motherboard and upgrade the BIOS. To upgrade the BIOS, we will require the Ryzen 1st Gen CPU in here. So once we upgraded the BIOS, we can put the Ryzen 2nd Gen CPU back in and see how it works. Now we go and download the BIOS from ASRock website. Right, this is my work PC. I also have a USB stick with me. I'm going to use this USB stick to upgrade the BIOS. So let's plug this into my machine, and it's detected. After all, updating BIOS is not that easy. It seems like there are lots of BIOS version in here since motherboard first release. Um, what I'm going to do is set up the motherboard again and install the Ryzen Gen 1 CPU, boot it up to BIOS, and I need to check what BIOS version at the moment currently on the motherboard, and based on that version I need to download the multiple BIOS version on here. As you can see, it says not to install previous version, not to install the latest version of BIOS before installing the previous version BIOS. So it might crash your motherboard BIOS if you try to install the latest BIOS. So I'm gonna boot up the motherboard and see what my BIOS version currently on the board. Here we are again. Now I have installed the Ryzen Gen 1 series processor, which is compatible with this motherboard. So let's boot it up and see what BIOS version currently in the board. There you are. Previously I forgot to plug the monitor, so that's why we didn't get the display out. Now to check the BIOS version, you can see over here X370 Gaming K4, that's the motherboard name. This is the BIOS version, which is P2.10. I believe this is the very first BIOS version when the motherboard release. So we need to follow the instruction on the manufacturer's website before upgrading the latest BIOS. So as you can see, I'm using Ryzen 3200 Gen 1 CPU in here. So all we need is the BIOS version, which is 2.1. So let's get back to the download page and follow the instruction. Now we are back on the ASRock website, and this is the BIOS page. Yep, we had BIOS version 2.10, which is the very first version of BIOS. Even website BIOS version started from 2.2. That's the next update BIOS. Basically we can update the BIOS straight up to 3.1 without any problem. So, and then we will have to follow these yellow instructions on website. As an example, if you want to upgrade 3.2 BIOS version, website instructed, if you would like to update BIOS under Windows, please update the BIOS to P 3.0 or later version by instant flash firstly. So it says if you would like to update BIOS under Windows,
So basically we can update the BIOS on CMOS settings. That's fine. That's fine. But in here it says if the current BIOS version is older than P3.50, please update BIOS 3.50 before updating this version. So I'm gonna go ahead and download the 3.50 BIOS version and update the BIOS, and then I'm gonna upgrade the later versions of BIOS. So let's go ahead and download the BIOS. I'm gonna hit global here. So start downloading. There, then extract files to my USB drive over here. So that is extracting. So I'm gonna go to my USB drive. So that's the BIOS version 3.5. So according to website, I'm gonna upgrade the BIOS up to 5.4 because it says ASRock do not recommend updating this BIOS if Pinnacle Raven Summit or Digital Ridge CPUs is being used on your system. Pinnacle Raven Summit or Digital Ridge means the Gen 1 and Gen 2 CPUs. So if we upgrade 5.5 version of BIOS, ASRock actually not recommending to upgrade this BIOS. So why do we need to crash our motherboard? So I'm gonna stop at 5.4. I'm gonna go ahead and download 5.4 as well. Now before that 5.1. Now we have already downloaded BIOS, necessary BIOS versions and graphic driver. Let's see how it looks like in here. That's the graphic driver in here. Right, I'm gonna stick this USB to the our motherboard and let's upgrade the BIOS, shall we? Okay. Right, all set. I got the BIOS version of 3.5, 5.1 and 5.4 in it, and I'm gonna insert USB and let's power it up.
delete key. Right, we are in BIOS setup now. I'm gonna go to boot. There might have. I'm gonna go to tools. You can see here instant flash. Hit enter. It's automatically selected 3.5 version of BIOS, and let's hit update. Do you want to update UEFI to X370 for 3.5? Yes. Say yes. Now it's starting to update the BIOS. This may take a little time, so I'm going to fast forward again to save your time. Right, now the BIOS already updated. The process is finished. I'm gonna hit enter. As you can see, BIOS updated to 3.5 version. The next step is to upgrade the version 5.1, if I may remember. Let's go ahead and do that. Okay, let's power it up again, and it's booting. I'm gonna hit the delete key. Right, yeah, back on to BIOS. Here we are. Now we go back to tools, instant flash. Right, it asking which version of BIOS do I need to upgrade, so I will select 5.1, which is compatible Do you want to upgrade 5.1? Yes. So this will take little while again. I'm gonna fast forward. So now BIOS version 5.1 successfully installed. So I'm gonna press OK, and it will take little time to recognize new BIOS. It will have a couple of restart. Must be. Let's see. Yep. Detecting the BIOS now. There you are. So you can see BIOS version upgraded to 5.1. So we have one more BIOS. Let's go ahead and install that as well. Go to tools, install tools, right, BIOS after 5.1 BIOS. Slightly change the menu. Let's find out. That's the instant flash. Yeah, tools, instant flash. So we have lost rest of the option we had. Instant flash ROCH or something like that we had before. When the previous BIOS version there, but that's gone. We don't need that anyway. So I'm gonna hit the OK button and it's checking the BIOS versions again. Now we're gonna go for 5.4. Yes, 5.4. Yes, there you go. It's gonna take little time again. Voila, BIOS version 5.4 successfully upgraded. I'm gonna press OK, and as usual it's gonna take a couple of restarts before booting up. Let's see. Now we have installed our necessary BIOS. All we got to do is to install Ryzen 2nd gen CPU and see how it boot. And let's go ahead and do that. Let's take the Gen 1, leave it there. Here's Gen 2 CPU. So let's power it up. You can see the debug code start rotating. It must boot. So new CPU, it will take a couple of restart to detect the CPU settings. Here we go. Successful boot. You can see there AMD Ryzen 3 2200G with Radeon Vega graphics, but I'm using external graphic card. You can still use the built-in graphic with this APU, or if you are having a second gen CPU without built-in graphic, that's fine. You can use the external graphic card like I'm doing. So guys, if you have a motherboard like this, an older version of Ryzen motherboard, and if you are thinking to upgrade to a newer processor, this is the way how you do it. And you must upgrade your BIOS to the latest BIOS version. In my case, I left 2 versions of BIOS because ASRock didn't recommended upgrading that BIOS in case if I'm going to use the Ryzen 3rd gen CPU. So to confirm that, I have a Ryzen 3rd gen CPU in my hand, and I'm going to install that into this motherboard and boot it up, and let's check it out whether it's going to boot up or not. I'm going to go ahead and install the Ryzen 3rd gen CPU in here and see how it goes. So this is the 2nd gen CPU. I'm going to turn that off. There we have the Gen Ryzen CPU. This is Ryzen 3 3200G, if I remembered well. Only way to find. I'm going to install it to the motherboard. Put the cooler down. Turn the power supply on. Right. It seems like motherboard reading the CPU there. You can see the debug code here circulating. It will take a couple of restarts. Voila. there you go, guys. You can use even Ryzen 3 3rd gen CPUs with this motherboard. If you see here, this is Ryzen 3 3200G CPU, which is a 3rd gen. If you learn something, just don't forget to hit the thumbs up button